December 2023. The Bernese Alps, Switzerland. A camera trap mounted to a spruce tree captures a single frame at 2:47 in the morning. Low-slung body, dark fur, unmistakable rolling gait. Researcher Marco Riva pulls the image from the memory card and stops cold. He has spent 11 years monitoring these slopes. He has never seen anything like this. But the camera doesn't lie. And then the DNA lab confirmed what the image already suggested. A Wolverine, alive and moving through the Swiss Alps for the first time in over a century. The last verified alpine Wolverine was recorded in 1924. Nearly 100 years of silence. One confirmed individual. A population so fragile it barely qualifies as a foothold. The margin for collapse is almost total. That's not what happened. What the data is now revealing reaches far beyond one animal in one valley. The central question this raises, what happens to an entire mountain system when its lost predator finally comes home, still doesn't have a complete answer. And that is exactly why this story matters. I'm Dr. Henry Vale, and this is the full arc of one animal's century-long absence, and what its return is already rewriting about alpine ecology. This story moves in 3 acts. The vanishing when hunting and habitat loss pushed the Wolverine out of the Alps entirely. The silence, nearly 100 years during which these mountains reorganized themselves around an absence most people never even noticed. And the return, a single animal crossing 500 kilometers of fragmented European landscape to reach a place its species hadn't touched since 1924. The sources behind this story are the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, peer-reviewed findings from the Journal of Alpine Ecology, and field logs from the X-Force expedition team that followed the DNA trail after Riva's discovery. These aren't anecdotes. This is verified data from people who spent years in the cold waiting for exactly this moment. The stakes here are larger than one Wolverine. A single species returning after a century can function as a living diagnostic of an entire ecosystem. What it eats, where it travels, what it avoids, what it changes, all of it becomes a signal. The Alps have been running without this signal for 100 years. Now the signal is back, and the readings are surprising. The Wolverine's extraordinary physical design would later become the exact thing that defined its impossible return to the Alps. But in the centuries before the guns came, it was just an animal doing what it had always done, moving through the high country like something the mountains themselves had made. Picture a January morning somewhere above 2,000 meters. The temperature has dropped to -20 overnight. A fresh meter of powder has buried the previous week's crust, and the wind is pressing hard across a granite ridge, packing snow into every crevice. Nothing moves. Nothing could move in this, you might think. And then something does. A shape materializes out of a wide slope. Low to the ground, broad-shouldered, moving with a kind of purposeful rolling gait that looks almost comical until you realize it is covering ground faster than you could run. This is Gulo, the glutton, and it is not struggling in any of this. It is thriving. The name comes from medieval Latin, and it is both unfair and completely accurate. Unfair because the Wolverine does not eat more than other predators relative to its size. Accurate because when it does eat, when it finds a carcass or makes a kill, it consumes with a focused intensity that genuinely has to be seen to be believed. But we will come back to that. What matters first is the body. The Wolverine is the largest terrestrial member of the mustelid family, the group that includes weasels, otters, badgers, and martens. An adult male tips the scales somewhere between 12 and 18 kilograms. That might not sound like much until you understand what those kilograms are made of. Dense muscle, a skeletal structure built for torque rather than speed. Paws that are disproportionately large, functioning almost like snowshoes, distributing weight across deep powder in a way that lets the animal move efficiently through terrain that would exhaust a wolf or a lynx. The feet are semi-plantigrade, meaning the wolverine walks on part of its heel as well as its toes, giving it grip and stability on ice and loose scree that few other animals can match. The claws are semi-retractable and curved, designed for climbing as much as digging. A wolverine can scale a near vertical rock face or a snow-loaded conifer without apparent effort. It can descend a slope by ploughing through chest-deep snow like a small, furious bulldozer. The jaw is built around a specific adaptation that sets it apart from almost every other carnivore in its range. The last upper molar is rotated 90 degrees inward, giving the wolverine the ability to shear through frozen meat and crush bone that would defeat animals 3 times its size. In winter, when every other scavenger is locked out of a frozen carcass, the wolverine is still feeding. I mean, think about that for a second. An animal the size of a medium dog, driving wolves and bears off kills. There are documented observations of single wolverines displacing adult brown bears from carcasses. Not because the wolverine is faster or stronger in any straightforward sense, but because it is relentless. It simply will not stop. The aggression is metabolic almost. It is baked into the animal's operating system at a level that larger predators seem to find genuinely unsettling. The home range of a single adult male can reach 500 square kilometres. 500. In a landscape of valleys and ridgelines and glacial terrain, that animal is moving constantly, checking cached food stores, marking territory, covering distances that would take a human days of hard hiking. Females range somewhat less, but still occupy territories that dwarf those of most other carnivores their size. This is not restlessness, it is ecological function. The wolverine is, at its core, a redistributor. It moves nutrients across vast terrain in the form of cached meat, scattered bone fragments, and the biological material it leaves behind as it travels. Ecologists call this a keystone scavenger role, and it means that the wolverine's presence or absence reshapes the chemistry of the landscape itself over time. The reproductive rate tells you something important about the animal's evolutionary strategy. A female wolverine produces 1 to 3 kits per year. Typically, in a snow den she excavates herself, sometimes several meters deep into a drift. The kits are dependent for months. Juveniles disperse slowly. Populations recover from decline with agonizing patience. If you remove wolverines from a landscape, getting them back is not a matter of years. It is a matter of decades. And only then if the conditions are right and the pressure that removed them is gone. If that sounds bad, keep watching. The wolverine is built for extremes in every sense. Extreme cold, extreme terrain, extreme distances, extreme scarcity. It is an animal that evolved to function in the margins, in the places where other large carnivores cannot or will not operate. The high alpine zone, above the tree line, swept by wind and buried in winter, was precisely the kind of margin the wolverine was made for. For thousands of years it occupied that niche across the mountains of Europe, from Scandinavia through the Alps and into the ranges further east. The alpine population was the southernmost expression of the species, genetically distinct in subtle ways, shaped by the particular conditions of those mountains, adapted to the specific prey and terrain and seasonal rhythms of a landscape that is unlike the boreal forests further north. This was not a population on the edge of its range struggling to survive. This was a wolverine population in its element. The wolverines celebrated their dominance of the high country for millennia. They shouldn't have, because the same extraordinary set of traits that built the wolverine's success in those mountains, the wide-ranging, the fearlessness, the willingness to take livestock as easily as wild prey, the slow reproductive rate that made every loss hard to recover from, was about to destroy it. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a landscape when a predator disappears. It is not the silence of absence exactly. The birds still call. The wind still moves through the larches. The streams still run in spring. But something in the ecological texture of the place has changed, and if you knew what to listen for, you would hear it. By the early decades of the 19th century, the Alps were changing fast, not just in the sense that all landscapes change, but in the human sense. Roads were being cut through valleys that had been accessible only on foot or by mule for centuries. Settlements were expanding upslope. Pastoral farming was pushing into higher and higher terrain as population pressure in the valleys grew. The summer Alp, the high pasture where cattle and sheep were driven each June, was no longer the edge of the human world. It was becoming the middle of it. Into this expanding human footprint came the Wolverine, doing exactly what it had always done, ranging widely, scavenging opportunistically, taking whatever was available. And increasingly, what was available was livestock. A wolverine moving through a summer pasture does not distinguish between a chamois and a sheep. The metabolic logic is identical. Food is food. Cached food is survival through winter. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense, at least not from any rational conservation standpoint. Rather than manage the conflict, rather than protect livestock through herding practices or compensation schemes, the response across the Alpine range was systematic extermination. Bounty systems were introduced in multiple cantons and provinces, paying hunters for wolverine pelts and carcasses. That's not a typo, by the way. Governments were actively paying people to remove a keystone predator from one of Europe's most ecologically complex mountain systems. The fur had value too, dense and frost-resistant in a way that made it prized for trimming hoods and collars, since wolverine fur does not ice up from breath the way other pelts do. The animal was worth more dead than alive by almost every metric the 19th century could imagine. There was no legal protection, none. Across the entire Alpine range, in Switzerland, Austria, France, northern Italy, the wolverine had no status, no season, no limit. Any farmer, any hunter, any trapper who encountered one was not just permitted, but financially encouraged to kill it. The bounty system created a feedback loop in which the more wolverines were killed, the more the remaining animals, pushed into smaller and more marginal terrain, came into contact with livestock, generating more complaints, more pressure, more killing. By the 1870s, confirmed wolverine records in the Western Alps were already becoming sparse. By the 1890s, sightings were rare enough to generate comment in the naturalist literature of the period, the kind of comment that reads, in retrospect, like an early alarm that nobody heard. Habitat fragmentation was accelerating the process. Every new road through a valley was a barrier. Every expanded settlement was a gap in the high terrain the animals needed to move through. The wolverine's extraordinary home range, that 500 square kilometre sweep of mountain country that was its ecological superpower, became a liability in a landscape increasingly divided by human infrastructure. An animal that needed to move that far to survive was now running into walls everywhere it turned. In 1900, there were almost certainly still wolverines in the Alps. How many, nobody could say with confidence. The records were inconsistent. The taxonomy was sometimes confused with other mustelids, and the animals themselves were so wide-ranging and so rarely seen that absence of observation never reliably meant absence of the animal. But the trajectory was unmistakable. In the decades that followed, the records thinned further. A skin here, a reported sighting there, sometimes credible, sometimes not. The naturalists who cared were watching a population collapse in slow motion, and there was no mechanism, no political will, no framework for doing anything about it. In 1924, a wolverine was confirmed in the Alps. The documentation is sparse, as it tends to be for records from that era, but the sighting was credible enough to be accepted by the scientific literature of the time. And then nothing. The next confirmed record from the Alps would not come for decades. That 1924 observation sits in the historical record, now like a door closing quietly. Not a dramatic ending, just the last entry in a ledger before the page goes blank. The gap it left was not merely aesthetic, not simply a matter of one animal missing from a list of species. The wolverine had been the high alpine zone's primary large scavenger for thousands of years. Without it, winter carcasses that would have been processed and redistributed across the landscape accumulated differently. The nutrient cycling that the wolverine's constant movement had maintained across hundreds of square kilometres simply stopped. The predator-scavenger dynamic in the high country shifted. Foxes and ravens and golden eagles filled parts of the niche, but not all of it, and not in the same way. The Alps had lost something structural, something load-bearing in the ecological architecture of the mountains, and they had lost it so completely and so long ago that within a generation or two, almost nobody remembered it had been there. In time, scientists studying the alpine ecosystem would understand exactly what this meant. But that understanding was still decades away. For now, there was just the silence. The particular silence of a landscape running one signal short, moving through seasons and decades, and eventually a full century without knowing what it was missing. Until the camera trap didn't lie. For a century, the Alps kept moving. Seasons stacked on seasons. Snow fell and melted and fell again. The high passes froze and thawed and froze. And somewhere in all of that ordinary continuity, something was quietly, invisibly shifting. Not in the rocks or the glaciers, but in the behaviour of every animal that remained. Think about chamois. Those sure-footed, amber-eyed goats that pick their way across near-vertical limestone faces like they invented the concept of balance. Without wolverine pressure, without that particular shape of fear moving through the high terrain, chamois populations expanded. Not overnight, slowly, across generations, the way behavioural change always works. A herd that had once grazed quickly and moved often began to linger. The wariness that wolverines had written into chamois instinct over thousands of years started to soften at the edges. Marmots, too, those fat, whistling sentinels of the alpine meadows, spread into territories they had previously avoided, their colony sizes growing, their alertness patterns shifting in ways that researchers would only begin to document much later. This is what ecologists call a trophic cascade in reverse. When you remove a predator, the effects don't stop at the prey. They ripple outward and downward through the entire food web, changing grazing patterns, vegetation structure, soil composition. The real question is what happened behind closed doors, in the unseen interactions between species, in the slow rewriting of behaviours that no human observer was present to record. A century is a long time, long enough for an entire ecosystem to forget what it was supposed to be afraid of. The scavenger niche didn't simply disappear when wolverines vanished. Golden eagles stepped into parts of it. Foxes took what they could. But it wasn't equivalent. Wolverines are extraordinary scavengers, capable of consuming frozen carcasses that eagles can't access and foxes can't crack open, capable of caching food under metres of snow and returning to it weeks later. The ecological service they provide is specific to their particular combination of strength, cold tolerance, and sheer persistence. A golden eagle is magnificent. It is not a wolverine. The niche stayed partially empty, like a chair at a table that everyone works around without quite acknowledging it's there. Meanwhile, conservation attention in the Alps through the 20th century focused elsewhere. The alpine ibex, hunted to near extinction by the early 1800s, became the great recovery story of the region. Starting in 1906, reintroduction programs began moving animals from the last surviving population in the Gran Paradiso Massif of northern Italy into suitable habitat across Switzerland, Austria, France, and beyond. By the late 1990s, ibex were re-established across much of their former range. It was a genuine triumph, the kind of story that generates photographs and plaques and a quiet institutional pride. Then came the wolves. A breeding pair confirmed in the Swiss Alps in 1995, natural recolonisation from the Italian Apennine population, moving north through France. Then lynx, reintroduced to Switzerland, beginning in the 1970s and slowly spreading. The Alps, which had been a landscape of absences for most of the 20th century, began to feel like a landscape of returns. Conservationists dared to use words like recovery, ecosystem restoration, rewilding, the vocabulary of hope. And through all of it, through the ibex programs and the wolf confirmations and the lynx surveys, the wolverine remained absent. Occasional rumours surfaced. A shepherd in the Valais in the 1980s described tracks in fresh snow that didn't match anything he recognised. A hunter in the Tyrol mentioned something in the 1990s that the wildlife authorities logged and then quietly set aside. None of it was verified. None of it held up. The wolverine stayed silent while its neighbours came home. By the early 2000s, the scientific consensus had hardened into something close to resignation. Wolverines, researchers concluded, were not coming back to the Alps on their own. The nearest established populations, in Scandinavia and pockets of Eastern Europe, were simply too far away. The landscape between them and the Alps was too fragmented, too human-dominated, too full of roads and cities and agricultural plains that a wolverine, even a dispersing young male, willing to cover enormous distances, could not reasonably be expected to cross. Active reintroduction, if it ever happened, would require political will, public support, and a level of cross-border cooperation that felt, at the time, more aspirational than practical. Now, the science could have stopped there. It didn't. Researchers kept running camera trap surveys. They kept collecting hair samples from scrapes and burrows. They kept submitting data to databases that grew larger and more precise every year, waiting for a signal that almost no one seriously expected to arrive. That patience, quiet, methodical, slightly stubborn, is its own kind of story. But here is what those decades of absence actually produced, and this is the part that tends to get lost in the celebration of what came later. 100 years without wolverines meant 100 years of accumulated ecological drift. Not catastrophe, not collapse. Just drift. Slow, generational, nearly invisible. Chamois that grazed differently. Marmot colonies distributed differently. Scavenger networks operating with a gap in them that the other species worked around but never filled. Vegetation patterns subtly altered by the changed grazing behaviour of prey animals that no longer carried wolverine fear in their muscle memory. When the camera trap image finally surfaced, that single, unmistakable frame from the Bernese Alps, the animal in it wasn't just a wolverine. It was 100 years of questions arriving all at once. Everything the Alps had built in that century of absence, the new behavioural baselines, the redistributed populations, the ecological assumptions that had quietly calcified into something that felt permanent, was about to work against them. There is a particular way that distance looks different once you know something crossed it. 500 kilometres. From the Jura Mountains on the French-Swiss border, southeast through the Swiss plateau, through farmland and motorways and the lit sprawl of cities, and then up, finally, into the Bernese Alps. A young male wolverine almost certainly born in the small but established Jura population, the product of natural range expansion that had been creeping southward from Scandinavia and Eastern Europe over decades of protection. He would have moved mostly at night. He would have used river corridors and forest fragments the way a needle uses the spaces between threads. He would have had no map, only instinct, and the wolverine's particular genius for persistence. Dr. Lena Hartwig's DNA analysis confirmed it. The genetic signature was unmistakable, Jura Mountains origin, consistent with the northern expansion lineage, distinct from any captive population or reintroduction program. Nobody put him there. Nobody planned the route. The route was his. And this is the part that keeps pulling me back to that first camera trap image, the one we started with, the dark shape moving through the snow at 2:47 in the morning, indifferent to the infrared flash, indifferent to the century of absence it was ending. He didn't know what he'd done. He was just moving through terrain that suited him, following whatever internal logic drives a young Wolverine to cover ground that would exhaust most other animals. We talk about wildlife recovery as though it's something we architect. And sometimes it is, the IBEX programs, the lynx reintroductions, the careful political negotiation that brought wolves back to landscapes that had forgotten them. But sometimes recovery is something that happens despite the landscape we've built, not because of it. Sometimes an animal simply decides the distance is crossable and crosses it. We didn't restore the valley. We returned the animal that knew how, and then got out of its way. The Wolverine story isn't unique. Every silenced ecosystem holds an animal waiting for the moment we stop deciding what's impossible. Subscribe to catch the next comeback.